So this is the book that we made, and this was the first introduction. I think the red lines were the first parts of it, and it was really to start the conversation. And we fast forwarded to what potentially the book could be and what the art project could be. And Annick, you spoke about the leporello in some of your thinking. There's the little world, which is also the ball of the dung beetle, but which is also the shelter, possibly. Yeah, so it was the beginning.
And the House of Cards.
And the House of Cards. And a potential future vision with lots of interesting notes. So then came the next page. Which is taking the House of Cards further, seeing how we could animate the House of Cards with projections or videos or images. And you can see it as a form, but also what the shelter could be if it's just a box, and acknowledging that Earth itself is a space shelter. And this was where you first used the outer or elsewhere phrase, which is quite nice. Yeah, traces of conversation. Move to the next one. And then so from that moment, from the outer or elsewhere to the space shelter, we actually explored outside and inside, what the shelter could be, what an enclosure is, or whether it's even enclosed, a closed versus an open environment. Yeah, they're the
underwater telescope.
And the expansion, the question of Earth's edge. Yeah, and then sheltering Earth. So the question of, this was quite an important drawing, I think. This little moment was Earth being sheltered versus Earth sheltering something else.
It was sheltering space.
Sheltering space, exactly.
And
that was sheltering
Earth.
And this was shelter inside another planet.
Yeah.
And it's shadow of the other planet on Earth, which is the impact that it would have on Earth. So it's actually quite a nice sequence, this one. It goes from the underwater world into space. That one was a very nice one. Yeah. And then we were looking at, I think it was about objects.
No, it's where we could do it.
Oh yeah, the way we could do it. And then we're speaking about Venus, and there is the melting Venus, the Venus of Willendorf. So we've got so here we spoke about the objects of observation and instruments and the
Italo
tools.
Calvino.
Yeah, Italo Calvino, exactly. Yeah, where's that taking us? Unknown. Yeah, notes towards the unknown. Let's see where it takes us next, because I think, so this was the idea of, you spoke about the rose, the frozen rose in Mars.
And this was a shelter for the rose.
At the same time, it was a shelter for the rose, but it was also communicated to another space. So
and then we went to this idea of deployable and
the
folded.
Deployable and the folded. Yeah. Or the collapsible and its value, yeah. And in this page, we started to really look at some of the content and the ideas of the shelter, of the space shelter, and possibilities for exhibitions and activities. So it got quite practical, but also a little bit interesting around the shape of the shelter.
Yeah, and this is basically Annick interfering with,
which is fantastic,
with Marcus drawings.
And then we've got here where we introduced the scream. The idea of the emotional that needs to become part of this journey of finding the space shelter concept, and the emotional shelter, and the debate around, discussion around what it means to be in a shelter, and what does it feel like, what is the inner and the outer part.
Here is Marcus' corner.
Yes, the corner of creation and production, and sometimes the corner is important, and other times it's what's in the corner and the corner disappears. which is quite fun. And obviously a notion of vulnerability and all of these kind of movements of emotion into that direction. Now we're turning to the next page. And so we just continue of this trend of emotions. And this was interesting because this was then this idea of what the space shelter could be. And from the emotional departure points to something that is then taking form. So content versus form was the discussion. And then we looked at quite specifically what form could be. And we were talking about the data visualization and the framing that usually happens. And so if a frame sits within a pre-programmed and pre-planned orientation, what happens if that changes, if the frame changes, if both the algorithm and the frame could become variable rather than the constant components, and what do we then end up with? And how do we access it? How do others access it? And how does it dock to another system? And this is where you did your drawing.
Yeah,
on
different forms of shelters.
Exactly, and the different components.
And docking different shapes.
Yeah. I don't know why, but I made this bridge that takes you from wherever all along to be able to get into the shelter. So it kind of sits on a bridge. But it was more, conceptually it was about the organic form that evolves and that is not about a rigid frame or rigid algorithm, that everything's about flexibility in us finding what the space
it was
shelter
about the
could
shape of our form, which developed here.
And so then we spoke about how do we access that shape, how do we collect the content. So this was a summary of the kind of idea of physical workshops, but also the hybrid, the virtual contributions, the collective studio spaces, and then how that generates content and form that flows thematically with different multimedia applications that are past the three pillars of space, shelter, and earth. Into another dimension, so that we don't get sucked into those pillars, but rather we go on that journey that starts through a collective process and then avoids just being stagnant inside the pillars. And they look so nice and dirty, those pillars. They look like factories of some sort, which is so nice. And so from this flow, past the pillars, you can see much more. It's very blue and green, which is quite nice, and it's very airy. But it's taking us through the different phases of the project that we're currently thinking about until 25. So it starts off with a kind of an experimental workshop. In this case, is planned for Linz, for Ars Electronica, where we start to define the notion of a kind of a suitcase or a toolbox, the form, the byproducts of that process, and it's again the little people down there being in a collective workshop that then creates something temporary. That's the initial component, and then doing the workshops in the north, which is quite fun because the north being at the top is almost like a bubble that sits under a surface, versus the workshops in the south, which is like a nest or like a cocoon that holds the data that comes down and the experiences to create some form. And then we spoke about the installation dispositif. And the idea that there could be an extra cherry on the top session in the north if we do that way.
And the thing is that we talk about collective studio sessions.
Yes.
Because we wanted to have this idea which is wider than the usual workshop.
Pause. Okay, now we continue. This is now Annick meeting Yogi and Bronwyn and getting to understand what the zone is and Yogi's project around the expanding possibilities and pushing the boundaries, and introducing her take on art and science and our response as the zone, and the interesting discussion that ensued from there. And you can see including an introduction to space art, as well as all kinds of notes around collecting of data and information and exchanges around different practices. And what's exciting about it is this crazy bubble of conversation, which is exactly what it was for me, the exchange. But there are some very interesting concepts in here around constraints that are enabling, around the rigidity versus the fluidity, around various spirals, etc., that I think will inform our thinking quite a lot in the pursuit of the space shelter. Sorry?
It already did with two words that we used later, which was evolution and life.
That's true. Yep. So, yeah, pull that out. So much more peaceful suddenly. This is still the same session with the zone and going into discussions, and with a focus here, which I really liked, which is focusing on what is not there, which is a lot of what we're doing in both the zone and in Space Shelter Earth, looking at the unknown and exploring that. And yeah, the notes around it, and it's almost landscape-like, which is quite nice. It's got questions of that came up around trees and people and rocks, so I included those. And yeah, the notes here connect to the previous session, and it's a simplification of the previous session. And that simplification continues, because then we really said let's focus on what this shelter concept could be and what it means. Space shelter Earth, what are the combinations, and what are the elements that we want to consider. So we have Earth as space shelter, we have sheltering space. Here we've got shelter in space, whether it's machine or human, for a machine or for a human. We've got space Earth shelters, which is other planets that could serve as shelters, like Earth. And then obviously the very important component, the probes and the machines that are extensions of our bodies, and in that sense do represent some form of our lives in space, and about protecting
and
those.
The social fabric and rules.
Yes, and the social fabric and rules, very important. That actually define how we shelter space and its experience.
Sorry?
Yeah. So this explosive one is quite fun. Here the so-called flag of the beginning of the process in 2022, which is the More Than Planet and the Imaginary Futures at Global Peripheries, and the different voices and elements that came into it that started to create form and content, and the workshops that we're going to take in pursuing it further, and the multitude of shapes and multi-approach to finding what space shelter Earth could be, and the different terms and definitions that come with it, in relation to our critical questions that we want to ask in the sessions that we've kind of worked out. And as you can see by the scratching out different things, took a while to formulate correctly, but the third component after the first two major questions is the process of allowing it to evolve and to become something. All right. So here we've got a big map, which is quite nice. It looks like a map of action. So the number one on the map is this moment where we ask the question of what do you feel in a space shelter? The scream, getting the emotional element out, acknowledging that it's a studio, it's a space of vulnerability, it's a space of exploration, and and we design from the responses rather than coming up with a structure beforehand. And we try to go beyond what everyone knows. It then links to the second component, and the second component is the first question that we then ask about the form of the shelter, where we say, well, then what should the space shelter be? So what does it take as a form and a concept? And then we try and combine all the shelters of everyone to see what the personal shelter becomes in the collective. And we then ask the question how it relates to Earth, and workshop in the studio the potential outcomes for that. So then
playing the game.
yeah, so here we were playing the game of actually answering the questions for ourselves, and trying to make sense of the content. We can go into detail, but I think the notes will speak for themselves around some of our personal responses to it. questions of exiling came in. Once you're in the space shelter, how does it make you feel? Do you feel connected? Do you feel disconnected? How does the body hold the shelter, and how does the shelter define the body? What is it in relation to other shelters like the shacks, or Annick's way of organizing herself in her shelter by placing books and pens and things in neat little piles while I scribble around. And so the notes that are in here are very personal reflections by Annick and myself on our journey that we took during asking ourselves the same questions that we will be asking in the workshop.
But some of those questions were beyond our personal answers, like the notion of home, the notion of exile.
Yeah, and I think and then we spoke a bit about, and that's quite important, the self-reflexivity of the potential space shelter Earth, given the fact that many people have thought about this topic. Others have got their own types of shelters, whether it's a cocoon, whether it's something that's designed by scientists, etc., for space use already. And we thought, well, what happens if we start bringing that referential material into our mix? So it's not just about personal references, but also, or personal reflections, but also popular imagery, and how would they feature as part of our research.
Can I add something here?
Yeah, sure.
It's also where the evolution came into play.
Yes.
As the shelter holding the body, but at the same time framing the body, and what this is the whole story of evolution, how the Earth and ourselves came out of evolution, and we were shaped by evolution, but now we're contributing, shaping the Earth and other creatures together with evolution, I would say.
Mm-hmm. So space shelter Earth is actually about also that, again,
Yes.
being referring back to us having been through this process already too, which is quite nice. So we're repeating time, we're just doing it in a new way. Yeah. It's the evolution of... Then we started to think a little bit about organizing the data and the information. So this idea of a leporello that goes in all directions, that can be compiled into some document, and the images that are collected and found, the reflections, the personal aspects, the images that will eventually make a space shelter Earth concept, what we capture, how we act, and how we activate the dispositif, what happens to the installation that we want to build, where does the information come from, how do we hold it, how do we control it, but at the same time, how do we give it its own life, and how do people contribute, be it from a distance via these windows or these frames, or be it live, being in the installation, and in what here for me is quite a loose evocation of what Space Shelter Earth could look like. So it's got no particular form yet, but it's definitely informed by quite structured Leporello type drawing like this book, the windows that come in from Zoom and everywhere else, and obviously our activities that we plan.
Yeah, because the idea is to have this modular form dispositive that comes from an activation of the sessions, through the sessions, and that can stand like that or be reactivated and will evolve itself.
Mm-hmm. And then the last image in the sequence is coming from that abstract concept of what this installation could be and how it could get reactivated, and to say that because we don't know what it is, this landscape that could hold it is quite abstract, and it just is a connection between different places, and the idea that we are developing it as part of the process, and that the open-endedness of it is very, very important to actually the design process, because if we have any sense of what we wanted to beforehand, we'll just end up with the thing that everyone else does. So how do we use our processes to develop content and form? And all we've indicated here are potential places where we could do it. So that's supposed to be the Eiffel Tower.
Where we started.
Where we started. I guess that's the Duomo where it can go. yeah, and it's also about the relocation of it and the reaction of the context on it and it on the context. So what happens to the Space Earth shelter when after we're finished with this project, it is able in a suitcase just to move on to the next location, and the unknown is very important in that case. So that takes us into this last frame, which is everywhere and anywhere, elsewhere, exactly. And these were the notes from our session.